All right, here we go. Good morning, everybody. I really appreciate you joining us, and we're very fortunate to have joining us today Marc Faber. Marc Faber is the editor and publisher of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report. You can find that at gloomboomdoom.com. And I have to tell you, I'm embarrassed to say that I was not a subscriber to this, although I watched your appearances all the time on wherever I find them on YouTube, on CNBC. But I got a chance to dig into your newsletter this week, and I was shocked. It's so impressive. It's and not that I didn't expect it to be impressive, but it really blew me away because I learned so much. I was educated by it. Of course, you give a market overview, but you give this historical context, which I thought was incredible, and that's in every issue that I looked at. And then you also give specific stock recommendations. So as far as newsletters go, this might be the best single value newsletter in the world at $300 a year. If you don't buy it, you're an idiot. I'm going to subscribe. Everyone should subscribe. So thank you for joining us, Marc.
Thank you for the advertising. It's very kind of you.
I mean it totally sincerely, absolutely sincerely. I was blown away.
Well, no, let me second that emotion, actually, because I've gotten Marc's letter on and off for many years. I'm pretty familiar, as you are, Matt, with most of the products in the newsletter world. And one of the things about Marc's letter is it has actual intellectual depth and actual thoughtfulness and actual research into history, as opposed to just clever marketing and glib opinions. So everybody listening to this should sign up for it, and I kid you not.
We'll have a link.
Well, very kind of you, Doug. I mean, I've been reading your letters, I guess, since the early 70s. I guess you started actually in the late 60s, if I recall, because already in the 70s, you were a well-known stock market personality, and in particular, specializing at the time in gold.
Well, we shouldn't give away our age that way, Marc.
Well, one thing I do want to talk about is gold stocks, but I want to save that really toward the very end. There was, as I went through your issue this year or this month, there were some things that really jumped out to me around wokeism, and propaganda, and totalitarianism that I think are worth discussing. Because you bring up these great historical references. You talk about Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism and her book, The Human Condition. And in it, you quote one part of it in particular. It says, before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts. And it seems like we live in a world with absolute extreme contempt for facts. Wouldn't you say?
Well, I'm sure Doug would agree is that the media in America is very biased, and that not all the available media, official media, or the mainstream media, not all of it is poor. Some of it is actually very good. But in general, the listener, he will not know what is actually the fact and what is untrue. I mean, I give you a very simple example. A few years ago, in 2014, there were riots in Bangkok. The students, and they were occupying a small square of a few buildings and a park where they slept, and the student burned a few tires and maybe also damaged some cars, but CNN then made it look like the whole country is up in flames. Whereas, we in the north, they didn't even know about it, what was happening there. They knew there were demonstrations, but when they saw these CNN movies, it had nothing to do with 99.999% of the country. It was just one small square in Bangkok. And so the media frequently gives completely wrong impressions to the public, which is, of course, not very desirable. And the consequence is that you have now this social media and lots of programs like we are having tonight. But a lot of them are also untrue, and a lot of them are also fake, and some of them have actually been infiltrated by the mainstream media. In other words, they are owned by big media groups, but they appear to be independent. And so when they broadcast, they give the impression that their news is actually a fact, when uh, the truth is that they also have fake news. So uh, basically, you bring a country into dictatorial, totalitarian state by confusing people to the extent that one day people say, well, I don't know, I have no clue. I'm happy if a strong man takes over and runs the country properly. You understand? So they give it up actually voluntarily, not because they want a dictatorship in their country, but it's just are so confused and uncertain that they actually give up their freedom.
Yeah,
So is that happening in the US right now, Mark? In other words, now that the Americans have elected actual Bolsheviks to run the government in Washington, is that where we are in the US?
Bolsheviks, yes. Yes. The remarkable thing is that after the experience of the Bolsheviks in Russia, which was absolutely horrible in terms of human pain, and the labor camps and the gulags and so forth, that they are even considering such a system, and that actually some people are actually financing them. You know, we all know that the Bolsheviks got a lot of Jewish money. You can explain this partly because at the time of the Tsar, we have these pogroms in Russia where the Jews had to live in certain areas and were not allowed in other areas. But anyway, they had a grudge against the Tsar and the regime, so they were more prepared to have a regime change. But still, it's remarkable that out of this whole Bolshevik revolution, they got what they deserved, namely Stalin, who was really an unpleasant leader. He was not necessarily a bad leader, but he was an unpleasant leader.
unpleasant is a great word to describe him. Yeah. But you say we all know, and you talk these historical references. I think part of the problem in the United States is that actually people don't know. I think people have no sense of history.
But this is not only in the US. You know, I have this large collection of Mao memorabilia in my office. And young Chinese come into the office, they hardly looked at it. They didn't actually, they heard about Mao, but they didn't know the significance of Mao in a historical context, and certainly not in the context of modern China. So I think it's but it's going to get worse because, as you know, now at many universities and schools, it's politically incorrect to to actually explain or deal with history. We actually don't know exactly how history was precisely, but there are more likely scenarios than others. But these more likely scenarios, they are dismissed as politically incorrect and as damaging young people's minds, because that is the big thing, that you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings anywhere.
Well, I heard that you had, and you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but your own run-in with political correctness. Where and again, you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but this is what I did hear through the grapevine.
Well, the media thought that I was a racist. That is the view they interpreted my writing. My writing was for my newsletter. It wasn't for a wide public consumption. But that was enough to basically ban me from the media. But it doesn't matter. I'm actually grateful it happened because it really brought home to me how actually certain things that you and I might think are free are actually controlled.
Hmm.
You know, that say one media outlet would say, well, we don't want to have him anymore on our program, is one thing. But that they all did this on the same day, you understand? As if they would talk to each other. And it's interesting, later, maybe 2 years ago, I was invited in India for a speech, and they actually had paid in advance, which is unusual, but they had paid in advance. And then it turns out that Morning Star in the US is one of their shareholders. And a few days before the presentation, they said to me, they're very sorry, but Morning Star objected to me being on this program at this conference, which was a virtual conference in India. So since they already had paid, it's okay. I just wanted to mention the word came from upstairs, not from the Indian organizers, but it came from high upstairs. And that's how things are organized. You know, we always talk about free markets, but I think Doc would agree with me that in many industries you have an industry lobby that is extremely powerful and that knows how to pay off the politicians and so forth. And so you have a system that, and this is remarkable, that in a democracy where essentially everybody should have a vote, but now you have a system where you have almost a uniparty in Washington. They protect each other. You know, hardly anyone in Washington ever goes to jail. He would have to be almost an outsider to go to jail. They all protect each other. And so the industry, in combination with the politicians, they form a powerful union that essentially is a threat to a democracy. Now, I'm not arguing that democracy is the best system. Maybe we shouldn't have a democracy in the first place. But when you tell your people, you know, you're free, then you have also an obligation to ensure that freedom. And if you look back, and I mean, I'm sure Doug would agree, if you look back at history, in all of human history that has been recorded, we never had a reaction to a pandemic where essentially business owners, small business owners, were expropriated, not expropriated by taking the business away, by just closing it. There is essentially the equivalent. If you're at a restaurant somewhere or a small business, then the government comes and closes it. You may have borrowings, or you may have had friends come in with some financing or whatnot. And now you can't exercise your business. I mean, you're gone. You lose all your accumulated savings. And I've seen this on numerous occasions. This crisis that is largely man-induced has actually hurt the poor people the most. And we also have statistics where unemployment has gone up the most, where the number of jobs has fallen the most. It's in low-paying industries. And I can see it in Thailand, you know, say a chain of store like 7-Eleven is owned by some big people. They're actually, the family is the richest family in Thailand. they are open, but other shops in the street and small restaurants have all had to close.
Same pattern as here. Yeah, interesting.
You know, it's actually, when you think about it, and every day when I have my prayers, I pray that the poor people are not hurt too much. They are hurt badly, whereas we, the capitalists, still live reasonably well. And some of the capitalists have actually increased their wealth because of money printing and fiscal subsidies and so forth. But the poor people actually have suffered a lot. And this money handout is, of course, in the long run, very destructive for an economy.
Well, wasn't Lenin right when he said that the capitalists will sell us the rope that we use to hang them? Because I remember in your case, you had lots of consulting agreements with corporations, not media corporations, but mining and other corporations. And you got into a lot of trouble with them because of these idiots at Morningstar, whoever it was that didn't like something that was not only perfectly true and accurate, but private in your own letter. I mean, I was shocked. And this was 5 years ago. So it's
yes. Well, you know, people said, of course you're right, but you shouldn't say it. But my view is, in a democracy and where you are, I was born in an environment where people, our teachers, are not only at primary school, but in secondary school, at university, they always told us about how important freedom of the press is and freedom of expression. So I think in a normal society, you should be able to express your views without being threatened or actually kicked out of universities, or, you know, like Facebook and some other service providers, they just eliminate some people who have views that do not conform with what their view is. In other words, they become kind of the censor. What we had in the Soviet Union and under Hitler, a censor office, they take upon themselves to be the censor of, like, this COVID business. You know, some scientists, they have totally different views than the views of Dr. Fauci, which is, by the way, a very shadowy individual. But anyway, to have a different view should be open for discussion and not just shut down for no other reason than the view that is different. And there are university professors that expressed some views. They were kicked out of their universities. I don't feel sorry for myself because I'm comfortable and I didn't suffer financially. But say, if you're a teacher at a university and this is your principal source of income, to be kicked out of a university may be a very distressing event in your life. So I'm considering all these people, when they see that and they have a job and they depend on the monthly income to actually pay their credit cards, these people are going to shut up. They will never again say anything. They'll just shut up. And so you move into a society where anything controversial goes to a committee within the corporation or whatever, and then they tell you, well, no, you better don't say that or write that, and at the end you have just pravda like of propaganda.
Yeah, it's almost like
that is the outcome.
Yeah, it's a soft form of totalitarianism. You don't need to necessarily round people up who say things they shouldn't say.
It's the beginning.
Yep. One thing you said was about COVID-19, that you assumed it was a small exercise quote, organized by our future rulers in order to test our obedience, and then say, and it's testing our obedience for something else. So what is the next step with this COVID phenomenon, or this totalitarian phenomenon in your mind?
That's it. I think we all agree. We don't know what the next station looks like because you were traveling on an unknown road. But I think there will be a next step at some point, and it's unlikely to be very pleasant. And I think whereas this event was used to actually boost the income and prestige and positions of the wealthy, contrary to what they say. You understand? They come and tell the people in America, oh, we're going to give you a check of $1,400 and so forth. But if you look at all the stimulus payments and the money printing, actually is a very small amount went to individual people. The bulk went into, as I said, the corporate sector that earns, say Walmart, they earn money from anyone who goes shopping. So if you hand out money to people, they cannot give up food and some medicine, and so they go shopping and spend it. So it lands up in the hands of the capitalists and people like you and I who own shares.
So where's this?
But it's not correct. Yes.
Where is it all going to end? I mean, what is the end phenomenon of this immense stupidity and corruption that we're seeing all over the world?
Yes, I like what you said. Stupidity and corruption and ignorance, of course, that goes with it. I tell you, my concern is this, that we have now what they call, that's what they say, an economic boom because of the money printing and the fiscal deficits that come at the same time to the economy. That will last, as we can estimate, say 6 months or so. And then what's the next stimulus? Each stimulus, in order to have the same impact, will have to increase very significantly. In other words, the size has to be increased constantly. And each injection of liquidity and of fiscal measures will have a lesser and lesser impact on economic activity. So the economy is not going to do very well. What can do well are certain assets like cryptocurrencies or precious metals. There'll be inflation. I just read today that the cost of the average home in the US as a result of increase in lumber prices, etc., has gone up by $30,000 in a year. So these type of things will happen, but they erode the purchasing power of individuals, so the economy really never improves much. In fact, it's likely to worsen. And one day they will say, well, all this, and this has happened already in the US with this trade war, that is another symptom of extreme stupidity. But anyway, the trade war can become a real war at some point. And, you know, if you look back at the last 200 years, whether it's the Crimean War or Gallipoli or the First World War or the Second World War, actually, none of these wars had to happen. It was some people that wanted the war because they hoped to gain an advantage, and some people have actually gained an advantage out of the war. But in general, they were all avoidable. But I think if you look at different theories about what leads to war, the framework, what is favorable, what creates a favorable condition for war. It's in place. And I think it's most unlikely that a peaceful solution between the existing power, the US, and the rising power, China, can be found. I think it will come to confrontation. And if the conditions in America deteriorate badly economically and socially, the government will then use the excuse of a war to undertake very restrictive measures on the population. And usually a war is always popular, at least in the first 10 days or 30 days, and until the results begin to come in. And then the results can be hidden for a while. And the fanatics, they will, of course, in the media tout the war as a very beneficial thing for the US and so forth and so on. But that, I think, is a likely outcome to the current problem that we already have socially in the US.
Well, I completely agree with you, Mark. But one question is, where do you go? Where do you hide from this situation? Because Matt and I have talked about this in the past, and the whole world is becoming very homogenized. And where can you go to get away from all this chaos that's building up? What's safe? Where's a safe space, as the social justice warriors like to say, a safe space?
It's a safe space. I like that. Well, you know, this is a good point that in a kind of globalized world, there is no such a thing as a safe place. It's like when you and I grew up, our parents or grandparents, they used to tell us, you know, you have to save some money, and then you put some money in a savings account in a bank, and that money will then obtain some interest. And when you grow up, you have some money on the side to buy something or whatnot. So saving was safe. But nowadays, as you know, in most of Europe, we have negative interest rates. In the euro, we have negative interest rates in Japan. And the deposit rates in the US are very low. I just received from my banks in Hong Kong, these are US dollar deposits. The 3 months is like, or a year is not even 1%. So with the current inflation, and there's always been some inflation in the system, it's basically a deeply negative interest rate. But like that, there are not many safe places. I can give you a few hints. In chaos, it is more likely that you're better off in remote places in the countryside than in a major city. Because in a major city, less in Japan, but more in the US, when things go bad, there's immediately looting, as we know. And in the US, in some circles of society, looting is looked upon like with, or attached to it, a stigma of heroic. A hero is someone who opposes the police, ideally kills the policeman, and burns down a shop or burns down a high rise and so forth. But this is the fact. In Japan, it's the opposite. In Japan, if there is a misfortune that happens to you, your neighbors will come and help, or the people will help. Looting is frowned upon and is very, very unusual that it would occur also in Chinese society, in societies that live by the teachings of Buddha. Stealing is very bad anyway, also in the Middle East. But nowadays, it seems that in Western society, this is quite acceptable. And in that environment, you're probably better off somewhere in Tennessee or in Illinois or in Idaho or Montana, in a smaller city or in some small villages, far removed from, say, the East and West Coast. So one criteria would be go and live as far away as possible from the socialists.
Well, you know, it's a paradox.
From
Mark.
Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
It's a paradox because for many years, when I'm in the US, I've lived in the People's Republic of Aspen, Colorado, and it's full of socialists and social justice warriors, but it's full of extremely rich people. So we're not going to have any rioting here, but you know, all of these wokesters have put themselves at the end of the road in a mountain town where they're safe from the consequences of what they cause elsewhere in society. It's rather perverse.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, the socialists who finance BLM, they are the so-called salon socialists. They live in fancy villas, you know, they are billionaires. They are in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, and they finance these uprisings that actually hit the black population much more than, say, the white population. And so we have this paradoxical situation. And this is something, when I grew up, I never thought it possible. I always thought, you know, extreme poverty leads to socialism. But it would seem to me that actually intellectually, the rich people are attracted to socialism because they live so well. So they think, well, this is maybe unfair that we live so well compared to others, but they don't want to share their wealth. They wouldn't go and distribute it all. Or when they distribute it, they do it for tax reasons, not because they want to share it with other people. But it's like you say, you know, in Aspen and actually in New York, and people always say, oh, the Democrats and the Republicans and the Democrats are bad and this and that. But actually, among the Democrats, you have mostly wealthy people. You know, the really wealthy people in America are the tech people at the present time, and they're all very well, they're all leaning towards the left and not leaning towards the right.
You know, one of the things you talked about in your latest issue is you were talking about someone who, you know, I wish I knew 1/10 of what you know about history, but you were referring to Hilaire Belloc, I think the name is, that's how you pronounce it, and then this book called On the Road to the Servile State. And in there, they talk about one of the key things that has to happen in order for freedom to die is for people to become propertyless, for them to lose their property. And I just think it just reminded me of what has been said recently by the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab is, you know, his idea of you will own nothing and be happy. And what do you think about all that?
You know, it's what is good for you is not good for me. I own the property in Aspen, but you shouldn't own anything. You know, that's an attitude, in my opinion, that has to be rejected very much. I am critical of the capitalistic system, but I don't think that the market economy and the capitalistic system have failed. What has failed is the government, and what has failed is the regulators, because, you know, let's say we play soccer, then we have rules, and we have to obey these rules. And as long as we obey these rules, the game is fairly fair, not 100%, because as you know, before matches were recorded, some arbiters or the people that judged were on the field judging the game, they didn't see some fouls, which later on you can see with the videos. The same in tennis. Before, you couldn't really know 100% if a tennis ball was inside the marks or outside, but now you can do that. So some things have improved. But the point is, we need to have a system where there are rules, but the rules have obviously been bent through, as Doug pointed out, a lot of corruption. And the rules have changed. There are rules for ordinary people, and there are rules for the politicians in Washington, D.C., for the politicians there and their families and lobbyists and so forth. You know, there's a whole group of people that are very powerful. It's like a little bit the insiders. At the time of the Third Reich or at the time of Stalin, they had a lot of powers, these insiders, and they couldn't be touched. The law applied to everyone else, but not to these people, as long as they were in favor. But at least at the time when they fell out of favor, they were hanged or killed or whatever. But at the present time in Washington, even if they fall out of favor, they get a nice handout every year, and they go on to something else.
You know, one thing you were, I heard you in another interview commenting on the, you know, the government in China, and you were saying that, you know, everyone refers to the communist government in China and all of that, but you said something about like there's 100 million total members of the party. Ultimately, within that party, it's a meritocracy, a total meritocracy leadership is, and you were contrasting that with the U.S. system. Can you explain more about that? Because just because you live in that region of the world, you have much better sense of it than we do over here in the West.
Well, I'd say I don't think anywhere in Asia we have well-functioning democracies. But there is some level of democracy, and there are some ruling families that are relatively benign and that have created very prosperous societies. I mean, the Americans always criticized Lee Kuan Yew, who is the father of Singapore, and attacked him on at every occasion, although the Americans have a military base in Singapore. But anyway, they constantly attacked him, especially the journalists. But actually, he built a society that functions very well, is well organized. I mean, Doug has been to Singapore many times. He can tell you how good the infrastructure is. Same for Hong Kong. You could go anywhere in China, you will find a better infrastructure than in most American cities. I'm not saying all American cities, because some have actually a decent infrastructure, but in most American cities, the infrastructure is not particularly good. And so in China, we have a system. The Communist Party rules the country. It is a one-party rule, okay? There's no other party than the Communist Party. The Communist Party consists of, say, about 100 million people. That's less than 10% of the population. Some people will say, well, it's not a democracy. Well, who knows what the ideal size of the number of people should be that vote and take decisions. The Athenians, only Athenians could vote, and only certain Athenians. Also in the 19th century in Britain, only taxpayers could vote. I think that's a very good system.
Yes.
I think in America, on local election, anybody should vote. But on federal elections, I think only taxpayers should vote. People that pay federal tax, others, they have nothing to do with the federal government, so they shouldn't pay and shouldn't vote. So anyway, in China, you have these 100 million people that are in the Communist Party. And then in order to move forward within the party hierarchy, you have to do certain jobs. You know, if you're a businessman, then you have no ambition to move up within the party because you have your business. You're just a party member who supported. It's the way. In Germany, people joined the Nazi party because of their business or because of their personal condition. The same under Stalin, people joined the party because they wanted to have the opportunity to be employed in, say, state-owned enterprises, like, say, the theater or the opera and so forth. So these people, they tended to join the parties to get these jobs. Anyway, in China, to get upstairs to the central committee of the Communist Party, you have to go through different steps. And each step, you have to prove your value. Now, I admit that there are, of course, powerful people that can help you upstairs. You understand? If you're from a very rich family, you will also get upstairs more quickly when you join Citibank or JP Morgan's or UBS's private banking department in Hong Kong, because you can bring in a lot of clients that are wealthy. So, but this is throughout the world. This is an injustice, maybe, and maybe it isn't. I don't know. I'm not here to judge how the entire world should function. But I'm just saying, in China, at the top, you have very capable people. Say the top 50 state employees in China at the very top of the Communist Party, I'd say 90% are hyper qualified. They really get things done. Whereas you look at the US, at the highest level of government, you have actually the worst scums at the highest level of government. That is the outcome of the US system. I'm not saying in Europe it's much better, but all I can say, in China, at the top, you usually have very qualified and clever people. You, by the way, just listen once to a speech of a Chinese official. They are very well spoken. They know what they're talking about and so forth. They're very smart. I think people underestimate the Chinese because they grew up with the image of the Chinese pulling rickshaws around with wealthy foreigners sitting in them. They have the impression that they obtained from the fishing in Peking, which was the Boxer uprising in 1900 or 1898, something like this. Anyway, the Chinese is nowadays not a rural society anymore. In many cities, the GDP per capita is higher than in the US. And as an example, this created a lot of tensions with Hong Kong, because the Hong Kong people, as Doug well knows, tend to be very arrogant, and they always thought, oh, we are the Hong Kong Chinese, we're so smart, and the dumb Chinese across the border, they need us. We have the only deep sea port along the whole Chinese coast. We have the knowledge, we have the stock market, all this. And whereas in 1985, Hong Kong made up for 25%, 27% of the Chinese GDP. Today, it's less than 3%. It's very small. It's irrelevant. China doesn't need Hong Kong anymore. It's convenient for some financial transactions and so forth, but it doesn't really need it. And there are hundreds of ports along the coast in China. And Shenzhen, which had a population of maybe 10% in 1980 of Hong Kong, or not even 10%, has now a larger population than Hong Kong, and Shenzhen is bordering Hong Kong. It was all paddy fields before. And also all the big technology companies are not in Hong Kong, they're in Shenzhen. So the progress of China has been mind-boggling. And I can understand, you see in America, there are quite a few people, they are the believers in containment. Usually the containment American style means conquest or increasing your sphere of influence, like they did in Europe after the First and Second World War. And in Asia, America didn't have a single military base before the Second World War. After the Second World War, they had in like 20 different countries military bases. So anyway, that's the American style of containment. And the Chinese are not like the Europeans. They're not going to accept a vassal state status. They're going to want to be on equal footing with the US and so forth. So the tensions there are, in my view, inevitable. It doesn't mean that the tensions will lead to a world war, but it could. It could.
You know, Mark, of course, one difference between these Western societies and China or Japan and Korea is there's no immigration into China. I mean, China is for the Chinese, Japan's for the Japanese, but in America, it's become a multicultural domestic empire. And there are going to be millions of poor people from Latin America coming to the US. And in Europe, I suspect there are going to be many millions of poor people coming up from Africa and from the Middle East. So how is this going to affect us? I mean, is this a serious thing? Is this going to happen in Europe? That it's going to be like a petting zoo for the Chinese on the one hand, and an immigration area for the Africans on the other hand. So I'm very pessimistic about Europe in particular.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. But you have to ask yourself, why on earth did Europe do it? You know, they could have refused to let these immigrants come in and so forth. Someone told them to do it and to accept it. I don't know who, but someone wanted to destabilize Europe. I can tell you what you said is absolutely true. In some countries, in 20 years' time, the white man will be a minority. The majority will be Muslim. When you think about it, I mean, my history teacher, he always said, well, you know, it was very fortunate that the Romans defeated Hannibal, because otherwise we'd all be black in Europe, because Hannibal was essentially colored. He may not have been 100% black, but he was to a large extent black. So the Europeans were, unique in the sense that they stayed as a Christian Judeo race. And that's why I suppose they became prosperous, because it was built on, some thrift and on discipline, which was brought in by the church. But I agree with you, unless there is a strong resistance at some point, in 20 years' time, Europe will be largely a non-white country. And the Chinese will stay Chinese, and the Japanese will stay largely Japanese, although they have started to open up a little bit immigration, because they have this remarkable population decline that we have to see. This is for Japan. It's a problem in the long run. It's good if you want to retire in Japan, you can go to a small village. It's 100% safe. Nobody will touch you. Nobody will steal anything from you. It's beautiful, but you're living in a dying village. We have the same in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, in Switzerland. Mountain villages are dying out, unless they have a resort area, for skiing, or in summer for hiking and so forth. But otherwise, small villages are undesirable in the countryside.
Well, Mark, that actually gets to a question I wanted to ask you about, because you're in Thailand, and Thailand has been so dependent upon global tourism for its economy. I mean, it's a huge component of it. What's it like in Thailand now, economically, and with the lockdowns and all of that?
The manufacturing sector is doing okay. These are exports. But what you're saying is absolutely correct. More than 25% of GDP in Thailand is tourism related. In other words, I think in 2019, we had close to 40 million tourists in Thailand. This is a huge number compared to the size of the economy. Now, this is down 95%. Because if you come to Thailand, you have to go into quarantine for 14 days. You can't have any visitors. You can't have any beer. You can't swim. They make it very difficult. So I think with the vaccines, things will improve. But again, I don't think that everyone wants to take a vaccine. I think a lot of people are reluctant, or a lot of people think it's not necessary to have a vaccine, because eventually everybody will have gone through the phase of COVID, like a phase of a flu. Some people became sick and other people were not affected, and so forth. But if you want to travel in future, I think you will need a vaccine. I haven't taken one yet, but I think in future, if you want to travel, they will require that. But in Thailand, the economy is doing badly for the simple people. They have no income. But you have to see, in Asia, and Doug having lived here and in other places in Asia and also in Latin America, he knows that in our societies, also in Latin societies, the nucleus of the family is very powerful. So if you are born in a family and your 5 brothers and sisters, the parents stay at home, have a small house or a small property, but they're poor maybe, but maybe some are not so poor. And then if you lose your job, then you can go home, you can stay there until things improve, until you find a job again, until the economy improves and you can go back to the factories and so forth. And this is the case in Thailand. We don't have, the social security network that you have in the US or in Europe. But I think there is some support by the families.
So basically, you're saying that this economic downturn, despite the fact there isn't social security and things like that, places like Thailand might better be able to cope with this decline than Western countries could?
Well, of course, some people are hurt very badly. People that worked in restaurants, nightclubs, bars, and so forth, they have no job. They can't find any job. So they are hurt. But what I'm trying to explain, in Asian society, in Buddhist or in countries that kind of live according to the teachings of Buddha, the help of other people is a factor. I mean, if, by the way, also for me as a Christian, if in my household and around me people are suffering, it is my duty as a Christian to help and try to alleviate their worries or pain or financial problems.
So if you were going to be stuck anywhere in the world, do you think that with all that's happening and all that you expect to happen in your, sort of doom forecast for the future, like, is Thailand, is it a good place to be? Do you feel good about being there as opposed to other parts? I know you're well established there, but other than that, other than the fact that you are already well established there, do you think it's a good place to be?
Well, let's put it this way. If you're East or West Coast liberal, ultra liberal American, and you think that everybody should have the same rights and so forth, Thailand is not desirable, because Thailand discriminates, like other countries, very badly against foreigners. You can live here 30 years and have become a Thai, a citizen. They will still call you a farang. A farang is a foreigner. Even though you may be a Thai, but you're a farang. Number two, say in the US, anyone who is in the US can buy a gun. I, as a foreigner, I'm not allowed to own a gun. It's not that I would buy a gun, because I don't know how to use them well. So if I had the time, I would shoot. I'd be shot 10 times.
Come to the US, I'll show you.
But you understand, there are many things, many jobs are not open to foreigners. It doesn't touch me because I don't work here and I don't want to work here and I don't want to be a Thai citizen. But for a lot of people, it makes their lives much more difficult. To open a business for you and me is much more costly than for a local Thai. Because we, in order to open a business that allows us to get a visa to stay here, not in my case and Doug's case, because we're over 55, but in other cases, in order to do that, you have to open a business and you have to employ, say, 5 or 6 local Thais. Even if you are in a business that has no local Thais that can fill these jobs, you need them just that you can have the business.
Understood.
But in most Asian countries, there are restrictions. Hong Kong is relatively free, even today. But it wasn't the case before. And of course, the Thais will argue, well, in Europe, we have difficulties in coming into Europe and so forth. But once they are in Europe, they can buy a property the next day.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the last topic I want.
So we have, when we talk, there are statistics about which country is highly racist and so forth. According to these statistics, and I'm very skeptical about this, but according to these statistics, number 1 racist country in the world is India. And Thailand is like number 3.
Wow. Wow.
They have different ways to measure what the racist is. Is someone who doesn't like you to be a neighbor. There are people who say, well, I don't want to live next to a farang, next to a foreigner.
I think, boy, if they should teach a little bit of that at American universities, it would really calm down all the racial tensions here. Because if they had any sense of the real world, the world beyond the U.S., I think it would change the perspective quite a bit. But
Yeah,
Doug,
let's hope so.
yeah, Doug, I had one more topic I want to talk about, which was gold stocks and precious metals in general. Was there anything else you wanted to make sure we talked to Mark while we had him here with us?
No, this has been.
I mean, about gold, as Doug and I've agreed with him since the 70s, gold will fluctuate, but in the long run, in a money printing environment, there's no question that it will go up in value. As you know, since last August, it's been in a correction phase. But for people that want to own gold long term, and since Doug and I will have an eternal life, we can think long term. Gold is ideal, and it has at the present time very little speculation, because the speculation has been absorbed by cryptocurrencies and NFTs and
Tax
and unicorns, and new issues and options and all kinds of instruments. But the speculation is not in the precious metals market, and it's not in precious metals shares. There's, like everywhere, a little bit of speculation. But say gold and silver, they have now corrected since last summer, August 2020. And in my view, they are now bottoming out and ready for the next assaults on the upside. I mean, the markets, they move in steps, a rise and then a correction, further rise, correction. I think we're in a phase where the correction phase is coming to an end. Our next move upwards will take place. So you're talking to the converted. I always said to people, you shouldn't put all your money into gold, because you may also wish to have some money in your house, in a property, and some income generating assets like high dividend yielding stocks. But some gold shares now are almost high dividend yields. And I'd say, if you don't own any gold and silver, I think you're making a big mistake as an asset allocator, as someone who wants to be financially safe in the long run. Does that kind of concur with your views, Doug?
Absolutely, Mark. I think that the gold and silver markets are bottoming. And as a matter of fact, out of all the stock markets, everything is in a bubble except for gold mining shares and commodity shares generally. Commodities are still very.
Agreed.
So I'm very, very heavy into these things cyclically. And I hope we have a bubble. We've had a bubble in a number of other areas. Maybe we're going to have a bubble in gold and silver stocks too. And then I'll hope to sell them, and I don't know what I'll buy. But what do you think about the major markets? They seem to be in a bubble. So what's going to happen with the major markets and with the bond market? I mean, how about things like that?
Well, the bond market obviously is in a bubble from a historical point of view. Say, in history that is recorded, we never had interest rates in the world this low. Never happened before. And the market, and that is what we touched upon before, the capitalistic system, there's nothing wrong about it, but it was disturbed by government interventions, and badly disturbed, so it doesn't function anymore, in the sense that poorer companies and poorly managed companies are eliminated. They're kept alive because of connections and so forth. So anyway, in the case of interest rates in Europe, they're negative. So the consequences of negative interest rates or very low interest rates is that it doesn't cost the government anything to spend without any limits, to distribute money. If interest rates were high, this wouldn't be possible. This is also my concern about wars. At the moment, it doesn't cost anything, monetary-wise, to go to war. Of course, the costs are very high, but they're not visible to the wide public. Say the cost of cheap money is that the government will expand at the expense of the private sector. So if you really want to go into state ownership, into, say, a socialist state, the best is zero interest rates, then the state can become bigger and bigger and bigger. And they can then also essentially buy up the stock market. They don't care because they issue money, so they at any price, a stock will be cheap if they can keep on issuing money where the money depreciates. So I think this is the danger of the current policies. It will empower politicians to do even, it's hard to believe, but even more stupid things than they've done up to now. It's difficult to achieve, but everything with politicians, everything is possible. So I would avoid bonds, but at the present time, I have a trading position in US treasuries, long-dated treasuries, because I think they've become very oversold. And I don't believe that the economy is as strong as the media is telling you. If you step out of your house, I don't know where you live now, probably no longer in Aspen.
No, I'm in the quiet and backward little welfare state of Uruguay, as a refugee from Argentina, actually.
So anyway, if you step out, you will see that a lot of people are struggling. I mean, it's visible. Only an economist at the Federal Reserve, he wouldn't see that because he never steps out of his house or out of his Eccles building in Washington. He's behind glass walls, dwelling in economic thoughts that nobody understands, that they don't understand, and that actually have brought about huge wealth inequality and income inequality. But if you look at the economy on the street, on the main street economy, as they call it, it's not strong. And so the bond market, the treasury bond market, may smell that after this bout of economic strength, that is short-dated economic strength in spending, the production is mostly in China. That's why the trade deficit goes to a record. So instead of making America great again, what has happened is it made America even more dependent than before. They now depend on imports from China and from Vietnam and from everywhere. So that is not desirable. But overall, we had this huge bull market. When you think about it, you and I went through the 70s and interest rates kept on going up on treasury bonds to over 15% on 10 years, 15.84% in September 81. And after September 81, we have this long-term bull market in bonds. And I mean, if you look at the performance of zero coupon bonds, long-term zero coupon bonds, it was fabulous over this period. I mean, this I give credit to Gary Schilling. He was right about the direction of interest rates, and they've gone down more than I ever thought possible. And probably you as well. We never thought when we studied the economics about negative interest rates. But anyway, that in the long run is the short of our lifetime, our remaining lifetime.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I remember, how long ago was it? I was with Jim Dines and in San Francisco, and we were trying to figure out what kind of a financial bet we could make with each other. And he says, the only bet that I'll make with you is that interest rates are never going below zero, because that's metaphysically impossible. And it turned out that even that was wrong. So we really don't know much anymore, frankly.
Yeah, because the markets are manipulated. The Fed will say, no, we stabilize markets. Well, it's a fine line between hedging and speculation and between stabilizing and manipulating. But anyone who privately would do what the central banks are doing, he'd be in jail,
Well,
for a long time.
Well,
but the central banks.
No, you're absolutely right. And of course, I believe that what we're headed into is something that I call the Greater Depression, because it's going to be much worse and much longer lasting and much different than the unpleasantness of 1929 to 1946. But, and of course, the economy will recover and things will get better because technology and science get better and people have a tendency to save and so forth. So the long term will be fine, probably. But I'm kind of gloomy in many ways about the next 5 or 10 years, certainly. What's your overview on that?
Well, I mean, that's what everybody says, that it will grow again and so forth. I'm far from certain, because there were periods in history where civilization actually retreated, where, you had a high level of civilization and then you went down because something happened that was unforeseen. And it usually happens in complex societies. Say, as an example, a complex society is what we have today. If you're in New York, you need someone to bring in the food from the countryside. Before it comes in, it goes to a processor. So the processor, he puts it in a storage facility, cooled facility, and then it comes into New York, goes into a supermarket or a shop and so forth. And you go there and you buy it and so forth, and you bring it home and you put it in your fridge. These are all very complex transactions. They function because we have a civilized world. But in an uncivilized world, and again, this is a politically incorrect term, but in an uncivilized world, people live in a household economy where the same household has a piece of land where they grow the vegetables, and they have maybe 1 cow and 3 sheep and so forth, and a few chicken, and they get these chicken and then they eat them, and the clothes, the housewife makes the clothes, spins wool and so forth. So it's not a complex economy in the sense that nothing needs to be transported, nothing needs to be refrigerated. It can all be taken care right away. More complex are societies that have climatic changes that require people to save for the winter time, they have to harvest and so forth. And then the most complex societies is what we have today. You and I, we depend on the internet. No internet, we're finished. We depend on electricity. No electricity, our fridges will not work, and we won't get any cold beer, period. This is the fact of life. And we have to be careful that we don't go back to these stages, and that we that we can guarantee a smooth transformation of technology that brings us to a higher level. You know, the Renaissance brought the world into an era of inventions and into the capitalistic age. And I mean, this, I do not agree with everything Milton Friedman said, but if you look at history, there's only one system that boosted the wealth of nations as much as it has in the last 100, 250 years, and lifted the standards of living, not just of a few rich, but of everyone. I mean, the fact that you and I can go and buy a can of Coca-Cola, and Warren Buffett, being the richest man in the world, he buys the same cola. He doesn't have a high luxury cola. He buys the same. Never in history did the king or the richest man in the country eat the same food as the poorest man. So there are things that our capitalistic system has brought about that are incredible. And if you look at the poverty rates around the world, everywhere, especially in China, it has diminished dramatically over the last 50 to 100 years. So when we talk about freedom, the freedom of hunger is something very important too. And I think in general, the media and everybody is far too negative about our capitalistic system. The capitalistic system, left alone, functions wonderfully. It's unfair. Please give me a system that is fair. But it has been polluted by politics and politicians. That is the problem.
We're in total agreement, Mark. But I think we're in complete agreement on just about everything. So it's a rare pleasure, especially speaking to you here from the People's Republic of Aspen, where I don't agree with almost anybody.
The People's Republic, that I love.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, Doug, I wish you well. You still write occasionally, right?
I have a blog called internationalman.com.
Okay,
And of course,
great.
so I do an article there every week. I'll make sure you get it because you may not. And of course, I have these 3 novels. I'm going to send them to you. Whether you have time or interest in reading novels, I don't know, but just I'd like you to put them on your bookshelf too.
Okay.
Right next to Mao. Right next to some book on Mao, of course.
Yeah, well, it's great, Doug, that you're still so active. I think if you have the good fortune of having the necessary health to be able to work, and you know, we had maybe a hard job all our lives, but it's not like someone who lays tiles on the floor, who at 50 years of age has entirely destroyed his knees, so he can't work, period. Or people who are working on buildings, they have some jobs where they carry such heavy load that they ruin their backs, so they can't work after 55. So we are fortunate in the way that we have jobs that are armchair jobs.
Well, and I have to say, we as viewers, we younger generation who have a great benefit of having you guys still very, very active and putting out incredible content to help guide us and share your wisdom. I mean, it really makes a huge difference to us. So I really appreciate it. And I, again, want to make sure everyone goes to Marc's website, which is gloomboomdoom.com. Sign up for his newsletter. It's $300 a year. It's the best $300 you'll spend. I guarantee it. It'll make you a wiser human and more able to succeed in the uncertain future that we have before us. So, Marc, thank you very much for joining us. It was a real honor.
Thank you very much to you, and of course also to Doug. I'm glad you look so healthy.
And likewise, you too, Mark. So I hope I get to see you again sometime in the real world as opposed to the Zoom
Yes,
world.
that would be great. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
Beer.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.